The evening was surprisingly quiet, even too quiet for this bustling city block. Amy was holding the hand of a small boy, leading him across the street, when she heard quick, heavy footsteps behind her. Before she could turn around, something dark and evil burst into her world. This meeting didn't happen by chance. An ordinary day in 1 second became a fight for life, not only her own, but also that of the child she promised to protect. Friends, if you see this video, remember, each of you is not just a viewer. You are part of our family, our community that helps us fight for truth, for safety, for equality for all. Please write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching us from. You are our support, our strength. Your thoughts and words mean so much to us. Together we are raising important topics and building a better reality for everyone. The evening was quiet, too quiet. At first glance, the silence seemed cozy, but if you listen closely, it seemed to muffle the city, hiding something disturbing behind its tranquility. It seemed that every sound was absorbed by something invisible, and even the wind, which usually teased the leaves of the trees, now stood still, not breaking this ominous silence. Amy walked down the sidewalk, holding tightly the small hand of the baby, who stepped trustingly beside her, clinging to her like something safe. Her heart was filled with warmth from this quiet scene. After all, this boy had entrusted her with something important, a sense of security in this world full of noise, bustle, and sometimes unpredictable dangers. Amy felt responsible for his peace of mind. For every step he took, they were crossing the street when the world suddenly became even quieter, and she had the strange sensation that someone was watching her, as if in the darkness, among the barely lit buildings, someone was hidden from her eyes but not from her heart. The moment she heard the first sound of footsteps behind her, her heart beat faster. Footsteps were quick, sure and heavy, like those of a man who approaches with purpose, leaving no room for doubt. She could feel the movement not only with her ears, but with her skin, with every cell in her body. This invisible someone from behind seemed to be invading her personal space, disturbing her comfort and tranquility, and her hand involuntarily squeezed the boy's palm a little tighter, as if in response to her anxiety. Amy knew she should look back, but suddenly a cold fear settled in her chest. Somehow, she already knew that what she would see would be more than just a random passerby. Her gut told her there was darkness behind her, not just evening darkness, but something much scarier and heavier. With each step, the silence grew more ominous, as if the night itself held its breath, foreboding something terrible. Amy held the little boy's hand tightly in hers, reminding herself to stay calm despite the thudding, rapid beating of her heart. The thought echoed over and over in her head. It's just a walk. I'm just helping the baby get home. She subscribe to Deeple Pro to edit this document. Visit www.deeple.com divided by Pro for more information. Wanted her voice to sound confident, but with each new step the footsteps behind her grew closer and louder, causing inexplicable tension in her soul. This child was no relation to her. She hardly even knew him, except for a couple of brief encounters in the yard of their shared house. But she'd seen him trying to cross the road by himself, small, frail, with anxious eyes looking around for something familiar and safe. Without a second thought, she offered him her hand, deciding that this evening would be just a small mission of kindness, a gesture of support, nothing more. But from the first seconds they'd held hands, she felt a wave of fear, a fear that couldn't be explained, a fear that seemed to clench her heart into an icy fist. The boy was dark-skinned, and now, as she felt footsteps approaching, she thought about how this small gesture of support could turn into something dangerous. Moments ago she might have felt strong and protective, but now she knew that something dark and evil was looming over her, something that left no chance for a peaceful end to this journey. The heavy footsteps behind her stopped. She didn't have time to turn around when a harsh, venom-filled voice broke the silence. What? You've decided to babysit these ones. Do you think you're going to help them? Amy felt each word sink into her like sharp knives, tearing away the shrouds of her world, her faith in justice. She frowned, holding back a scream. The boy's hand in hers trembled, and instinctively she clutched it tighter, so that he could feel her close. No, she would not leave him. Her gaze was fixed on the asphalt, as if there she could find the answer to what to do. But the voice continued. no longer just angry, but full of hatred fueled by something deeper and darker. You look at him, they're all like that, like dirt underfoot, and you must be the same. If you dare to walk beside him, to hold his hand. Amy shuddered. She felt the attacker's words hitting her own essence, insulting not only the boy, but also her for her kindness, for her desire to help. She looked at his face, contorted with hatred, and realized he would not stop. There wasn't just aggression in that look. It was deep, burning contempt. Her breathing quickened, and her heart pounded so loudly that she thought he could hear the frightened rhythm. The boy next to her began to sob. He was scared, and Amy, instead of comforting him, suddenly felt helpless. Would she be able to protect him? She wasn't prepared for this. Wasn't prepared that simply helping a child would be an act for which she would be hated, insulted. She looked at him, trying to smile, but her smile was weak. Her hands trembled, and she knew that this man saw her fear. You better leave while you can, the man hissed almost in a whisper, his eyes cold and full of cruel determination. None of us want to see you and him on this street. You'd better remember that. Amy looked up into his cruel, satisfied gaze. His savored her fear, her indecision. The silence around her was almost palpable, like a vistas darkness that squeezed her from all sides. Amy's heart was beating faster and faster, and now it felt like every beat was a rumble in her head. She could feel her attacker's heavy gaze fixed on her back, as if waiting for her to make the next move, to say something, or to try to escape. Her inner voice told her she had to protect the boy, but fear kept her chained to the spot. She looked around cautiously, and her eyes met his gaze, dark, burning, full of a hatred that was hard to explain but all too easy to feel. It was the kind of look that seemed capable of burning her from the inside out, of leaving a void where there had been warmth and caring. The man was tall, strongly built, his face contorted with anger, his every movement threatening, as if his whole body was ready to attack. What? Are you scared? Afraid someone will put you in your place? His voice was shrill, filled with malice and mockery, as if he found pleasure in seeing her fear. Amy felt the terror spilling into her chest, paralyzing her, preventing her from taking a step. She knew she shouldn't show fear, shouldn't give in, but the boy beside her, his small, warm hand in hers, reminded her that she was responsible for more than just herself in this situation. She gripped his hand tighter, as if she could give him the reassurance and protection she desperately lacked. You think he's one of us? That this kid deserves to be here, on this street, next to people like us? He continued, leaning closer so that she could feel his cold breath. People like him only spoil this world, and people like you helping them are even worse. Amy wanted to answer, but the word stuck in her throat like a lump that couldn't be swallowed. She saw her attacker looking at the boy with contempt, and in that moment, her whole world narrowed to one thought. How do I protect him? How do I make sure he doesn't remember this hatred? The boy, sensing her trembling, looked at her with frightened, tear-filled eyes, and silence between them. This moment of terror, shared between the two of them, seemed like an eternity. He was about 6 years old, no more, and there was more question than fear in his eyes now, as if he didn't fully understand what was happening. Why was the stranger looking at them like that? Why were his words like poison needles, wounding his only protector at this moment? Amy lowered her gaze and whispered, "It's okay, baby. We'll be right out. Don't be afraid." But the moment she tried to take a step back, the assailant blocked their path again. His face grew more and more distorted, and his eyes were nothing but cold malice. "You don't get it. I said people like him have no place on our streets. And you, what? You think you can walk away like nothing happened? You support it. You stand by it like we have to accept it. You're embarrassing yourself by giving him your hand. Are you one of them?" Every word he said was like a blow, and Amy felt each sound echoing in her, tearing her calmness apart. There was no doubt now that he would not stop. His hatred was boundless, imbued with years of prejudice and anger that he probably didn't even fully understand. To him, boy was simply an object of contempt, a symbol of something he couldn't and wouldn't accept, and Amy holding his hand was like a red rag, a challenge to his worldview. Amy took a deep breath, trying to gain some confidence. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to answer, "We're just going home. Let us pass." Those words seemed to anger him even more. The man stepped closer, breaking any remaining space between them, and now his face was so close that Amy could feel his anger like hot air enveloping her. Don't you understand? Girl, you have no right to walk here with him. You have no right to be around him. You're making a choice, and that choice could cost you a lot. Amy realized leaving wasn't going to work. The stranger's hard gaze was burning into her, but that was half the problem. He took a step forward, coming so close that Amy could smell his breath acrid, sour, repulsive. Her body tensed instinctively, preparing for the worst. She heard the boy next to her gasp in fright, but realized she couldn't let him see her fear. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like he had to hear it. I don't repeat my words twice, he hissed, looking straight into Amy's eyes as something monstrous boiled inside him. You don't understand where you belong. If you choose to side with the likes of him, be prepared for the consequences. He savored the words on purpose, saying them slowly, with growing fury, savoring each phrase as if it gave him a dark, twisted pleasure. Amy knew she was not just facing aggression, but something rooted deep in his mind, a hatred that lived on the level of instinct, unexplainable but unconditional. Her instinct screamed for escape, but where to? They stood in the middle of a nearly empty street, where only the occasional light in the windows reminded them that someone might see the scene. But each house was immersed in its own seclusion, as if the inhabitants didn't want to see or interface. She felt as if this silence was adjusting to her attacker's intentions, leaving them alone with his malice. The boy was trembling, his eyes full of terror. Amy felt the child's fragile hand clench in hers, as if that touch was his only chance to feel protection, something real, and it was tearing her apart. This boy was just a child, but to the man opposite, he was no person, no mere little creature in need of care and support. He was a symbol of the hatred that simmered inside him. You think he's one of us? Do you really think men like him will ever be our equals? He hissed, as if spitting out venom. These men deserve nothing but contempt. And you're the same way, standing next to him like he's your equal. The words cut through the air, and with it, her soul. Amy realized that his hatred was a hatred that had been nurtured, passed down, and accepted by him as something natural. This anger wasn't personal. It was part of his worldview that divided people into their own and strangers, those who deserved to leave and those who didn't deserve even a mere glance. Her soul was torn by the realization that in his eyes the boy was something less than human. Amy held back her tears, clutching the boy's hand and trying to make him believe he was safe. Even though she wasn't sure that was true, she knew that if she spoke, her voice would betray her the fear and anger that overwhelmed her. But silence meant submission, acceptance of his words, and that was unacceptable. You speak as if you know me and this child. You speak as if you have the right to decide who is worthy of respect and who is not. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to say it firmly, looking straight into the stranger's eyes. He's a child, and you know nothing about him. His eyes narrowed, and there was a barely restrained rage in them. Her words seemed to ignite more hatred in him, as if her boldness were a challenge to him, unbearable and unacceptable. He stepped forward, shoving her roughly, and Amy nearly lost her balance, but held on tightly, still holding the boy's hand. You don't understand. To me, people like him are just a mistake. They're not people we should share the streets, the country, the life with, and you're pathetic if you don't understand that. Those words sounded like a judgment. Amy felt that the situation had become not just scary, but truly dangerous. The man in his gaze was no longer human. He was hate itself, incapable of understanding, only of destruction. Amy realized there was no choice. Fear was no longer her ally. It was turning into a rock, pulling her to the ground. This man wasn't just angry. There was a blind hatred in his eyes, fueled by deep, unspeakable prejudice. He was literally boiling with anger, and everything she did only fueled that fire more. She stood face to face with pure, inexplicable anger, and there was nothing human in that look. She looked into his eyes, and strangely enough, the fear was gone for a moment, giving way to something stronger, a desperate determination. She couldn't let this man intimidate her, much less hurt the boy. There was no one behind this child who could protect him, only her. And even though this man was twice her size and ready to snap, Amy felt she had to stand to the end because everything depended on her now. You think you have the right to judge him? just because of the way he looks. Her voice trembled, but the echo of fear in it was almost gone, giving way to anger. Do you think you're better than that? You don't even know this boy. The man raised his eyebrows, his mouth contorted into a smirk, his eyes full of contempt, looking down at her as if she were nothing. Empty space. Better? Of course I'm better. That boy is a nobody. They're all nobodies. Men like him have no right to be here among us. And you know it. You're just a coward who won't admit it. He said it with such certainty, with such genuine anger, that Amy felt as if a torrent of mud had fallen on her. She could see how his words cut the boy like sharp knives. He may not have understood all the meanings, but he knew this attack was directed at him, at his life and right to exist. There was more fear in his eyes than Amy had ever seen him. The eyes of a child. He squeezed her hand painfully, as if he were trying to protect himself from the hatred that hung over him. Her gaze fell on his face, on his little crying eyes, and the pain of seeing this child in this situation overwhelmed her with renewed intensity. He was too young to understand why this man hated him so much, but Amy knew that if they didn't leave, this moment would be an open wound for him, a memory of a world that had rejected him for no reason. You have no right to talk about him like that. He's a child. He's not guilty of anything. Her voice grew louder, more determined. And you have no right to decide who is worthy of being here. The man laughed, and it was a loud, harsh laugh that echoed down the empty street. His laughter was not just contemptuous, but full of deep, sincere contempt, as if her words seemed to him insignificant. Stupid. I have the right. Everything here belongs to us, and you're just like them if you think you come cross me. It was as if his words were defiant, demanding submission, but Amy couldn't do it. She couldn't just let him humiliate them, turn the boy into an object of hatred and contempt. She felt her fear give way to something more, a sense of duty, a fierce determination not to back down in the face of his malice. No, you have no right to talk to us like that. You have no right to humiliate and intimidate us. The man stepped even closer to her, his eyes literally glittering with anger. Amy sensed that he was about to snap, that his hatred was already too great to contain. His hands tensed. He clenched his fists, as if every muscle in his body demanded an attack. But she didn't look away, staring straight into his eyes, full of hatred and contempt. I will say what I want and do what I want, and people like you will never be able to stop me. His voice was filled with a chilling coldness. The boy cried, his sobs piercing the silence of the night. Amy could feel that he was scared to the point of shivering. To his heart's content, she felt him cling to her tighter, as if she were the only barrier between him and this darkness. Her own heart clenched at the realization that neither she nor this boy mattered to this man. Amy stood there, clinging to the boy's hand, feeling every beat of his heart transmitted to her through that delicate, fragile touch. She knew he was waiting for protection from her, some reassurance that this was all just a nightmare that would soon be over. But her own knees trembled, and cold fear burned inside as the frosty air pierced her lungs. She realized that this man was willing to do anything, and his hatred knew no bounds. The assailant stepped forward, his voice coming at them like a whistling whip. Look at him. These pathetic creatures are always relying on us, always following, clinging like weeds at every turn. Do you think he's going to be anything? Do you think he deserves your protection? The words were like blows hitting her heart. Her cheeks flushed with heat, a mixture of shame and anger so strong she couldn't contain it. She saw every word like a knife, wounding this boy. Even if he didn't yet realize the depth of the hatred, he just knew that he was not accepted, that the person standing in front of them did not see him as a child, but as something alien and disgusting. He deserves life and respect like everyone else, she shouted, feeling her voice grow, harsh and loud with excitement. She didn't allow herself to look away. Her gaze was directed only at the man, at this embodiment of aggression and contempt. You can't talk about a child like that. You have no right. The man smirked, as if her words amused him, as if he was amused at seeing her resistance, like a hunter cornering prey. The right. I have the right to say whatever I think of men like him. People like him will always be down below us, and you're a fool if you believe anything different. You, like all those lying, blind people, believe the world can be different, but it won't be different. They'll stay where they are. Do you understand? His voice was full of venom and smugness. as if he were on top of the world, as if his hatred gave him power, and that power gave him the right to dictate terms. But Amy knew that if she gave in now, if she showed weakness for a moment, he would feel that he had won, that his hatred was stronger than anything she could resist. She looked down at the boy, who was trying his best not to cry, but tears were already glistening in his eyes. It was the look of a child who was suddenly confronted with the cruelty of the world and didn't know what to do. She felt his fingers gripping her hand even tighter, and that touch gave her strength back. You can say what you want, but it won't change anything. This child deserves happiness and love, and nothing you say can make us back down, she said firmly, fighting the urge to leave as quickly as possible, but knowing that if she took a step back, she would be admitting he was right. She couldn't let that happen. The man snorted derisively, his eyes gleaming with a cold light. Happiness, love, he spat on the ground beside them, as if even those words were something disgusting to him. He has no place in this world. Men like him will always be despised, and there is nothing you can do to help him. You're only giving him false hopes that will shatter once he grows up and sees what awaits him. Amy felt her heart clench with pain, with a sense of helplessness, but with it something new flared in her, not just determination, but a fierce desire to show this man that his words, his hatred, meant nothing. He is more than your hatred, and your words mean nothing. She looked straight into his eyes, full of coldness and contempt. There is nothing you can do to us. We will leave here, and your world will be a thing of the past, because people like you mean nothing. You are nothing but fear and emptiness. The man stepped forward, his eyes glittering, and she knew he was ready to snap. The boy beside Amy squeezed her hand until it hurt. His thin fingers were icy cold, and she could feel how hard he was trembling. His gaze darted from her face to the angry face of the man in front of them, as if he were trying to find a shred of reassurance, something to tell him that this nightmare was about to end. But his eyes reflected not a childish fear, but a horror of something greater and more overwhelming, a world in which he was being shown that he was a stranger, that he was not accepted, that he had no place here. Amy could see the fear pulling the boy into its cold embrace, the way his lips quivered, the unrestrained tears glistening in his eyes, ready to burst. He couldn't understand why this stranger was saying such horrible things, but he felt that they were directed at him, that he was the cause of this hatred. He was too young to realize it was bias, blind malice, but old enough to feel that he was being scorned for something he himself had not chosen. For a child who had always looked at the world with trust, it was unbearable. "And Amy," he whispered, his voice low, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Have I done something bad? Am I really bad?" His question tore her heart apart. In that moment, Amy realized how cruel the world could be if even a child was already beginning to blame himself for hatred he didn't deserve. She felt her eyes fill with tears, but she blinked quickly, trying to hold them back. She couldn't show weakness. She couldn't let the boy see her in this state. She couldn't let him think it was his fault. She knelt down, still holding his hand, and looked straight into his big, framed eyes, filled with the kind of bewilderment and grief that only a child can experience when faced with something he doesn't understand. "You haven't done anything wrong, sweetheart. You're a beautiful, kind boy, and that's all that matters. All of this, it has nothing to do with you," she whispered, trying to speak as confidently as she could, even though her own voice trembled traitorously. But the man interrupted them again, his voice even colder and more contemptuous, as if their connection this moment, when Amy had tried to defend the boy from his words, had only made him angrier. "You're deceiving him," he thundered. "You're making empty promises to him. No matter how many lies you tell, reality won't change. They'll always be down. They'll always be despised. And you, naive as you are, stand there pretending you can protect him from a world that will never accept him for who he is." His words were like poison, seeping into his soul, enveloping everything around him. The boy pressed himself against Amy, closing his eyes, as if he could protect himself from everything that was happening, as if by shutting out the hate he could return to his world, to calm and safety. But his tiny hands were trembling, and Amy could feel his fear literally seeping into her. She wrapped her arms around him, covering him with her body like a shield, trying to be at least a temporary barrier to him from this madman and his terrible words. She knew She couldn't erase this moment from his memory, but she could at least make him not feel so alone, so thrown into the face of blind hatred. You can't make him feel insignificant, she said firmly, but her voice trailed off, giving away how much she was worried. Your words mean nothing. They're empty. He is stronger than your hatred. He'll grow up to be a man everyone who knows him will be proud of. But the assailant was not going to retreat. He looked at them as if they were repulsive, as if their mere presence offended him, and he was literally seething with hatred. This boy was a symbol to him of everything he despised, and he savored every moment of seeing how his words affected them, how they penetrated his heart. You're a fool if you think things will be as you say. That boy will always be down. And people like him will always be a reminder that we're in charge here, that he's just a mistake to be avoided and despised. Amy felt that her words were powerless against this wall of hatred. The man would not change his mind. He would never see the boy as a human being, but she knew that her job at this moment was not to convince him. Her job was to protect the boy, to keep him safe from this hatred, even if she herself was ready to break under its weight. She stood up, holding the boy's hand, and gathering all her strength, took a step forward, shielding him from the man with her body. You can say what you want, but we're getting out of here, and your hatred will stay with you. This boy is not alone, and he won't have to carry the weight of your words. You're the stranger here, not him. Your prejudice and your hatred make you lonely, and one day you realize you've lost, because the world won't stay the way you want it to be. She felt the boy squeeze her hand tighter, and that touch gave her strength. Amy continued to stand, shielding the boy with her body, like a thin barrier between innocence and evil, between light and darkness. She could feel her heart pounding as if it were about to burst. Mixed feelings raged inside, fear, anger, confusion, but on top of it all lay your responsibility to protect the child, to not let her life be broken by this moment. It was impossible to hide that fear, but she did her best not to let it turn her into a statue, a helpless target. The man took another step, his face twisted in a wicked grin. His eyes reflected the obvious pleasure in the way Amy and the boy trembled before him. For him, this was not just a street encounter, but an act of affirmation of his power, his right to humiliate and despise those he considered beneath him. You can hide him behind your back all you want, girl, but it won't change anything. He'll always be what he was born to be, a nobody. And you, foolish as you are, believe you can change his fate. His voice was full of sarcastic pleasure. Amy felt her skin goosebumps at those words. With each word, his hatred grew deeper and darker, like an abyss pulling them into itself. She knew she couldn't talk him down or convince him he was wrong. His anger was too deep, his prejudices too hard, but she could fight for the boy. She could keep him from believing these lies. She squeezed the boy's hand, turned to him, and spoke so that he could hear her words through the fear and noise of his own heartbeat. Don't listen to him, kid. It's all not true. You're strong, you're kind, and you're special. Everything he says is his own fears and weakness. They have nothing to do with you. She saw the boy, still trembling, looking at her. His eyes reflected doubt, but her words began to penetrate him, like a ray of light breaking through the darkness. His palm gripped her fingers tighter, as if he were searching for a foothold in her, the only place where he could feel safe. But the man wasn't going to back down. On the contrary, her words had made him even angrier, and now he was seething with rage, ready to explode. He stepped even closer, and Amy felt the boy behind her literally pressed against her, hiding as best he could. You dare undermine my words in front of him? Do you think that telling him this lie will change the world? No, it will remain as it has always been. Men like him will always be nothing. I am the truth, and you, girl, are just a silly dreamer who doesn't understand reality. Those words were like a blow, but Amy didn't let herself flinch. She knew her only weapon was resilience. This man was like a storm, destroying everything in its path, but she was determined to be a rock in this storm, even if that rock cracked under the pressure. She took a deep breath, gathering all she had left in her. Her voice became firmer, calmer, and she spoke directly to the man. Reality. Your words are not reality. It's your pathetic idea of it, and it's dying every day. The world will not stay the way you want it to be. It is changing, and your fear of that change makes you weak. You need to humiliate children to feel powerful. It's pathetic. The man paused for a moment, his face contorted with rage. Amy's words seemed to have hit the target, to have struck a nerve. She saw his fist clench even tighter, the tension in his body rising, as if he were ready to lunge at her. At that moment, she realized that they were on the very edge, and that everything depended on her next move. The man stood in front of her, his face scarlet with anger, his eyes filled with malice, as if he were ready to explode at her word. Amy sensed that their confrontation was at its peak, that any move she made, any word she said, could be the spark that would set him off. She stood in front of him, shielding the frightened boy with herself, and a cold fear gripped her body, but she knew that to back down would be to admit he was right, to let his hatred triumph. She felt the boy trembling behind her, his small hand seeming to dig into her fingers like an anchor holding her in this moment. His touch had everything in it: fear, desperation, and the hope that she could protect him. The thought filled her with determination, though her heart was pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The man stepped even closer to them, almost close, his face contorted with rage. She could feel his hot breath, hear him gritting his teeth. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was literally seething with hatred, his power and aggression filling her like a dark vortex from which there seemed to be no escape. Do you really think you can make a difference? People like you will always lose. I'm telling you, that kid will always be nothing. Do you even realize that? He growled, as if every word coming out of his mouth was soaked in venom. Amy felt her lips quiver, but she held back. Her inner voice screamed at her to turn and run, to take the boy and save him from this hatred. But she stood, knowing that to run was to give in. She straightened, trying not to give away her fear, and spoke firmly. Oh, her voice trembled slightly. That boy is more than your hatred. He's more than all your words, and I won't let you intimidate him. You can hate all you want, but it won't change his worth. He's not what you want him to be, and you are not the one who decides his fate. Her words seemed to make him even angrier. He stepped forward, so that there was almost no distance between them, and his face came close to hers, his eyes blazing with rage. You're a fool if you think your words mean anything. You don't understand anything, he almost shouted, and his voice sounded like a threat, like a warning. I will not tolerate men like him on this land, nor men like you who dare to defend them. You will have no one to support you. You are alone in this. Do you understand? No one will come to your aid. His words were like a cold blow, and for a moment Amy felt terribly alone. He was right, in that there was no one around to help her. None of the passers-by had intervened. She and the boy stood alone in front of him, surrounded by emptiness, and that feeling could have broken her. But when she looked into the child's eyes, everything inside her exploded with determination. She couldn't leave him, couldn't let this man trample his sense of self-worth. I may be alone, but that doesn't mean I'm afraid of you. Your words won't make me weaker, and they certainly won't make him worse. All I see is your fear. You're afraid the world is changing, afraid of losing your power, and that's why you try to bully children. That makes you weak, not us. Her voice was quiet but firm. She stared straight into his eyes, unblinking, unwavering, and watched his rage grow more and more uncontrollable. He stepped even closer, his face only a few inches from hers, his fist clenched, and she felt like he was about to zap. The boy pressed fearfully against her back, and she felt his breathing quicken. Her own heart was racing, but she knew not to show weakness now. The man put up his hand, his face twisted with rage. Amy realized that their situation had become dangerous. Her heart was beating like a drum, and every beat of it was painful in her ears. She saw the man raise his hand, clenching his fist so white his knuckles turned white. Her instinct for self-preservation screamed to save the boy and get him away from this man. But the fear flouncing inside restrained her body. She tried not to show that she was about to break into a run, but she could see his face growing more and more filled with rage. Amy took a cautious step back, pulling the boy against her. Her eyes searched for a way out, any street, any alley, any escape route. She clenched his hand tighter, her fingers seeming to dig into his palm. Her movements were slow, as if any sudden movement would anger the man more and make him go for anything. You think you can just pick up and leave? He said, as if he'd read her mind. There was something deep and cruel in his voice, not just a threat, but a malicious delight in the way they stood before him in fear. You think your stupid stubbornness can save him? His words pierced her, and she felt everything inside her freeze with terror. She could see that he wasn't just aggressive, he was obsessed. This hatred was something personal to him, and he was willing to do anything to prove his superiority. His eyes reflected not only anger, but a desperate desire to hurt her, to subdue her and make her recognize his power. The boy was trembling again, and she could feel it with her whole body, as if his fear was transmitted to her through every cell. His breathing became hoarse, short, and she knew he was close to bursting into tears. She was his only shield, the only barrier between him and this man. Her instincts were crying out to not give up, to get him out of here at any cost. Gathering her wits, Amy took another step back and spoke, hoping her voice remained firm. We'll just leave. Leave us alone. You've already said everything you want to say. Please just move away. The man grinned, his eyes narrowing, and something like triumph flashed across his face, as if her words only fueled his cruelty. Oh, so you want to run away? Then, afraid of me? Fine, cowardice suits you both. That's all people like you are capable of, running away, hiding behind other people's backs, thinking someone will save you. But you know what? No one's coming. Amy felt a wave of despair wash over her. His words sounded almost like a sentence, yet they seemed to reflect a harsh reality. No one had really come. There was not a single person around ready to intervene, not a single witness, not a single passerby to stop the horror. This moment their loneliness became her reality, and she realized that they could only count on themselves. She felt her legs trembling, but continued to retreat, as if each step could distance them from his malice. The boy, sensing her anxiety, pressed himself against her side and his arms wrapped around her waist. He hid behind her, as if trying to blend into her shadow, and it only made her resolve stronger. Look, she said, feeling a sharp note of despair rise in her voice. He's just a kid. He hasn't done anything to you. Just let us go. We're not your enemies. The man grinned, his grin cold and inhuman. Enemies? You say that as if I thought you were my equal for a second. I just want people like you to know their place. You have to realize that people like him and people like you will always be on the margins, and no one will save you. Remember that. The words stabbed into her, cold and merciless, leaving a trail of deep, dark pain. She felt that she could no longer hide her fear, that her voice began to tremble. This man stood before her as if he were the embodiment of everything she feared, and that fear threatened to consume her. But despite her trembling and terror, she took another step back, pulling the boy close to her, and finally felt herself reach the edge of the sidewalk. She knew there was a street behind them, and if they could cross it quickly, they might be able to escape. Amy looked at the boy. His eyes were pleading and panicked. She took another deep breath, trying to give herself confidence, and whispered to him, "When I say so, we'll run, okay?" The boy nodded, his eyes glistening with tears, but there was a flicker of determination in his gaze. Her heart clenched, but she knew it was the only way to save herself. The man watched them as if he understood her intent, and his face contorted into a wicked grin. "Do you really think you can run away?" he asked, and his words sounded like a challenge. Amy met his gaze, and something flashed in her eyes that she couldn't explain. It was a mixture of fear and determination, a desperate belief that they could save themselves. She nodded to the boy and whispered. Now they rushed forward, breaking out of the circle of his malice as if from a trap, and ran across the street without looking back. Amy and the boy ran without looking back, their footsteps echoing through the deserted street as they crossed the road. Overtaken by their own fear, she could feel her heart beating in time with those footsteps, a resounding rhythm driving her on, as if any moment of delay could be fatal. For a moment it seemed to her that the man was behind her, that their running had drawn a line between them and his hatred. They turned the corner and found themselves on a street where the few passersby, busy with their own business, moved leisurely along the sidewalks. Amy felt a moment's relief. There were people here. They weren't alone. She slowed down, trying to catch her breath, squeezed the boy's hand tighter, and finally looked back. The man was still following them. His figure, unyielding and menacing, appeared from around the corner, and every step he took was filled with cold, implacable fury. Her breathing quickened again, and the wave of panic came with renewed force. She realized that the crowd of passersby could have been their protection, but despite her pleas in her heart, none of them looked in their direction. People passed by. Someone stopped to adjust their bag. Someone looked at their phone, and it all seemed so ordinary that their fear and anxiety were almost irrelevant in the midst of this indifferent calm. "Please help," she whispered, struggling to overcome the lump in her throat, unable to speak any louder. Amy felt helpless, as if her voice vanished into thin air. Reaching no one, the man was approaching, his gaze fixed on them with a predatory determination, as if their fear and desperation had only spurred him on. She knew he didn't need to explain anything to the passersby. One look was enough for him to stomp out their slightest desire to help. She spoke again, louder now, desperately calling out to the people around her. "Please, we need help. This man, he's threatening us." A few people finally raised their heads, their gazes meeting hers, but it was only for a moment. The faces of the passersby were indifferent. Some looked away, some shrugged. They didn't feel comfortable interfering. They saw no need to ruin their day for a strange woman and child. Some even stepped aside to give her way, as if her cry was not a request for help, but something inappropriate. Her heart clenched with a loneliness more acute and cruel than anything she had ever felt before. She and the boy were trapped in this crowd, among people who saw them but didn't want to see them, heard her words but couldn't hear them. She realized that people are always afraid to intervene in these situations, that it's easier for them to ignore someone else's pain than to take even the slightest bit of responsibility. The boy clung to her side, his face wet with tears. He looked at the crowd pleadingly, his eyes full of despair and wonder like children. He probably thought that adults always help, that the world is safe if other people are around. But in that moment, he saw the brutal truth that sometimes even adults choose to retreat, to not get involved, hiding in their own safety. "Don't worry, I'm with you. We'll get through this," Amy said, feeling her own words sound almost false, as if she were trying to convince herself rather than him. But it was all she had to offer, a reassurance she herself lacked, a fragile shield protecting him from reality. The man came closer, his steps lower, but he did not retreat. He knew now that none of the bystanders would stand in their defense, and that knowledge filled him with a cruel satisfaction. His face was contorted in a smirk, a gloating certainty burning in his eyes that he had triumphed. He lifted his head, glaring down at her and the boy as if they were pathetic, insignificant creatures, undeserving of the slightest respect. "You see, girl, no one is coming to help you. All these people you're hoping for, they're just like me. They know who's in charge here, and they won't interface for the likes of you." And that boy, his words, filled with venom and certainty, plunged her into an even greater abyss. She could feel her fear reawakening as it slowly drew her into itself, but she couldn't show it to the boy, couldn't let him see her weakness, even though everything inside screamed that they were all alone. She took a step forward, no longer hoping for help, but only for her own strength, which seemed so little. She looked at the man, with the last vestiges of courage left in her soul, and said, "I'm not afraid of you. You can intimidate me, but that won't make you stronger. You're just a lonely man who hides his weakness behind hate, and I won't let you destroy this." By the man frowned for a moment, as if her words had penetrated his armor. His eyes narrowed, and she saw in them not only rage, but a kind of confusion, as if her determination, her unwillingness to surrender, had shaken him. Amy stood in front of the man, her gaze meeting his eyes with fury. She could feel his anger growing, as if her every move, every word, even her courage was a challenge he couldn't ignore. His lips curled into a vicious grin, as if she'd managed to ignite something even darker and more aggressive in him. The passersby continued to walk past, their faces impenetrable and indifferent, and Amy felt more and more the heavy emptiness surrounding the three of them, turning this moment into something almost hopeless. He took a step toward her, closing the distance to a barely tolerable minimum. His face so close she could feel the heat coming from him, but that warmth was colder than any cold, as if even the very air around him was filled with malice. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, as if he were coaxing her to admit her helplessness. "You apparently don't realize who you're dealing with yet. You think you're strong, that you can protect him. Do you think your bravery will help you here? Among people like me, among those who understand where you belong." Amy tried to hold on, but his words seeped into her mind like poisoned air. It seemed to her that he really did have some monstrous power, capable of paralyzing her from the inside out, robbing her of her confidence and determination. But she knew she couldn't let him see her fear, couldn't give him that satisfaction. She squeezed the boy's hand tighter and took a step back, trying not to take her eyes off his. He wanted her to tremble, to show weakness, and she knew that if she did, he would be even more ruthless. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, but her voice trembled, and she knew he noticed it. "You can threaten, but I won't let you hurt him." His face frowsy for a moment, but then he grabbed her shoulder sharply, his fingers digging into her skin like claws. She flinched, not expecting him to actually go for it. Yes, his hatred was so deep that he was willing to overstep his bounds. His grip was strong, and it hurt her. Her body tensed, her every movement was chained with fear, and she realized that he could do anything to her. "You don't understand anything," he said, and his voice became low, almost hissing, full of hatred. "People like you and him shouldn't show up here, shouldn't think anyone will accept them. You'll always remain on the margins. No one will come to your aid, and you can't see that. These people," he pointed to the passersby, "they despise you as much as I do, only they just won't admit it." The words were painful, like a blow. Amy could see that his grip was even tighter, his eyes burning with hatred, and now she could clearly see that he was ready to hurt her. Her breathing quickened, and she began to realize that this man was ruthless and truly dangerous. The boy behind her back began to sob quietly, and it pierced her heart like a knife, making her realize that his fear was becoming even deeper and more overwhelming. She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. She felt the pain spilling over her shoulder, seeping into every cell, but she knew she couldn't let herself retreat, couldn't give up, even if her body had no strength left to resist. "Let me go," she whispered, struggling to keep her voice from shaking, trying to remain firm despite the pain and fear. The man grinned, his face contorted with contempt and anger. He let go of her, but only for a moment, and his gaze was still fixed on her. He seemed to savor this moment, a moment of her fear and weakness, her helplessness before his power. "You think someone will come after you, that someone will take your side," he whispered in her ear, his voice filled with grim triumph. "Look away, no one wants you. You're alone here, and your faith in people won't help you." His words were like poison, but Amy felt her soul still resisting. Despite her fear and despair, she knew that if she gave in now, it would break not only her, but the boy who clung to her, crying and trembling with fear. She couldn't let this man destroy her faith and hope. She took a deep breath, gathering the last of her strength, and looked into his hate-filled eyes again. "You're wrong," she said, her voice sounding muffled, but there was determination in it. "I have strength you cannot break. We have a dignity you can never take away." His face petrified, something wild, fierce flashed in his eyes. Amy realized she had almost no strength left. The pain of his iron grip on her shoulder was done, but she tried not to show the boy how scared she was, how deep her fear ran. Her main goal was to protect the child, to keep this man from winning. She felt his cold, contemptuous gaze on her and knew he saw her fatigue, her trembling, her helplessness. But even though her body trembled, her heart wouldn't let her give up. She was his only defense, and he was her only reason to fight now. The man, seeing her determination, seemed even more furious. Her defiance, her resistance, seemed to infuriate him, to make his rage uncontrollable. He stepped forward, again, loomed over her again, and now she felt that his gaze was not just hatred, it was a desire to crush her, to destroy her spirit, to make her recognize that he was stronger. "Do you really think you can make a difference? That your words mean anything?" He hissed, and his voice was as cold as the winter wind. "You're so naive. People like you always lose, and people like that boy always get left behind. Always." Those words were like blows, each one echoing with pain in her soul. He saw in them not people, not personalities, but only symbols of his hatred, his own prejudices, his pride, which could not allow that someone other could be near him, breathe the same air with him, walk the same streets. But there was determination in her heart, quiet, strong and unbreakable. She knew that if she gave up now, if she showed weakness, she would lose not only her dignity, but also the faith of the boy who was looking at her, searching for a shred of hope. Amy, gathering all her strength, stepped between him and the boy like a living wall, protecting him from the man's malice. Her voice, though trembling, sounded firm, You don't understand. This boy deserves to live in a world where there is no room for your hatred, and I won't let you make him feel insignificant. He's better than you can imagine, and nothing you say will change that." The man grinned, his face contorted in a contemptuous grimace. "You're pathetic if you believe words can change anything. You're just a woman defending an empty hope. Men like him will never change, and men like me will always be on top and you underfoot." His words pierced her, leaving deep wounds in her heart, but she knew she had to stand. She turned to the boy. His eyes were full of tears, and it looked like his world was crumbling right in front of him. She smiled at him, trying to give him a little bit of calm and reassurance, even if she lacked it herself. "You're special," she whispered to him, "and that won't change because of what he said. You'll always be whatever you want to be. No one can take away your strength and dignity." Those words, though quietly whispered, seemed to the boy like a lifeline to hold onto in this sea of hate and fear. He clung to her tighter, as if her words really were his protection, as if her promises were more powerful than the man's threat. But the man wasn't going to back down. His eyes narrowed, his face darkened, and he took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You dare humiliate me?" he hissed, and his voice was full of rage. "Do you really think your stupid words mean anything? I'll show you what real strength means." His one, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Amy felt a panicked fear flare in her soul, but she couldn't back down, couldn't let this man hurt the boy. She raised her hand, ready to take the blow, ready to protect the child, even if it meant sacrificing herself. She closed her eyes, expecting pain, ready for the worst. But just as it was about to bring his face down, someone nearby shouted, "Hey, what are you doing? Leave them alone." She opened her eyes and saw several passers-by finally stop, their faces full of indignation and outrage. People began to move closer, and the man frowned, as if the sudden attention had made him lose confidence. His face contorted in anger, but he knew he couldn't get rid of their judgment that easily. The crowd grew larger and larger. People looked at him with disapproval, and some started pulling out their phones to film what was happening. He took a step back, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Amy felt her heart begin to calm. She knew they'd been rescued, that they weren't alone now. Amy stood between the boy and the man, her body still shaking with fear and tension. But the presence of the other people, who were finally paying attention to what was happening, seemed to give her strength. She realized that now they had a chance. The stares of the passers-by became more and more intense, judgmental, and the crowd slowly thickened around them. The man, seeing that the situation was out of his control, was literally seething with rage and humiliation. He looked around, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Amy could see that he hated her even more, not just for daring to stand up to him, but for drawing the attention of others. Now he could no longer do what he wanted to do without consequences. But instead of retreating, he stepped forward, his face reflecting his willingness to be even more cruel. "You're all just like her," he growled, looking around at the passers-by with disdain. "Weaklings who don't realize where they belong. You think you can change anything with your views? You think I'll submit just because you're here?" Amy could feel his words hanging in the air, like an angry whisper, eating away at everything around them. Some of the passers-by glanced up, their faces full of indignation, but no one took a step forward. It was as if the man was defying not only her, but the whole world, showing that his hatred was above morality, above human judgment. He swung again, and Amy instinctively stepped forward, shielding the boy, ready to take the blow, knowing she had no other choice. "Stop!" someone in the crowd shouted, and Amy felt her heart squeeze with renewed hope. At that moment, the man, seeing that his plan was falling apart, lunged forward, clearly intending to hurt her at least one last time, to show his superiority. Even if only moments later others would approach him. His hand moved toward her, but she drew back, clutching the boy as if it would create an invisible shield around him. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin, and Amy felt her body tense with pain, but she didn't scream, didn't pull away, her gaze hard despite the pain and fear. "You think you've won? You're nothing. You're just a pathetic girl who doesn't realize that the world belongs to people like me." His voice was full of contempt and anger. Amy felt his words pierce her soul. She gathered all her strength and uttered, in a trembling but firm voice, The world doesn't belong to you. You can hate all you want, but the world is changing, and people like you are being left behind. Your hate makes you weak, not us." Her words, despite her fear, sounded firm, and the man, hearing it, seemed to lose his last drop of patience. But before he could do anything about it, someone from the crowd stepped forward. "Leave her alone," shouted the man holding the phone, and several other people followed suit, surrounding them. The passersby began to come closer, their gazes full of determination and indignation. Now they were not just watching, but actively intervening. They looked at the man with contempt and condemnation, and he finally realized that it would be impossible to continue his aggression. His face contorted with rage and humiliation. He let go of Amy's hand as she stepped back, feeling the pain throbbing in her shoulder. The boy, who had stayed close the whole time, looked at her with gratitude and relief as his fear slowly dissolved into thin air. The crowd grew larger and larger, their faces reflecting a support Amy hadn't expected. People began to whisper, expressing their indignation and displeasure. The man, sensing he had lost, looked at her with cold contempt, but now his eyes showed weakness, as if her fortitude and courage had robbed him of his strength. "You're all just lowlifes who think they can dictate to me how to live my life," he hissed, backing away, but his words no longer had the force they had before. The crowd surrounded him, and he found himself alone, as if lost among those he despised. Amy stood, cradling the boy against her, and felt her own heart finally calm. She realized that she had won, that their resilience, their determination had given them strength that was stronger than this man's hatred. Amy stood, still breathing hard from fear and tension. Her shoulder ached, the marks of the man's rough fingers bruising her skin, but the pain seemed to fade into the background. She still held the boy tightly, feeling his small palm clutching her fingers convulsively, as if her touch were his last support in this frightening world. The man was glaring angrily at them from behind the circle of passersby. He was almost trapped. He was surrounded by people looking at him judgmentally, and he no longer had a chance to vent his hatred with impunity. His face was filled with rage, but now there was weakness slipping into it as well. The realization that his power over Amy and the boy was melting before his eyes. People around him were pulling out their phones, taking pictures of what was going on, and every look at him reflected contempt. "You're all just pathetic," he shouted, as if hoping to regain his sense of superiority. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You think this ostentatious kindness is going to make a difference. I'm telling the truth, and you know it." His words sounded like a last desperate statement, full of angry, impotent hatred. Amy saw that his confidence was crumbling, that without his aggressive power he was becoming a lonely man, covering his fears with endless contempt for others. But the crowd around him only grew denser, the stares of the people turning into a wall they could not get through. One of the men in the crowd, elderly but stout and determined, stepped forward. His face was stern, his voice firm and cold-blooded. "Do you really think you have the right to treat them like that? You think your prejudices give you the right to attack a woman and a child? You're wrong, and no one here supports you." The man's words were like a blow. The man, who had recently been full of confidence and hatred, was momentarily confused, his eyes darting around like those of a hunted animal that had suddenly realized it was in a cage. He looked around, his eyes jumping from face to face, but he found no support anywhere. Another woman in the crowd, seeing the man hesitate, pressed her lips together and said loudly, "Shame on you. How can you not be ashamed? Attacking a child and bullying them is low. We see who you really are." Her words echoed through the crowd, and people began to support her, nodding and cheering Amy on. The man, hearing all this, turned pale, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. It was hard for him to bear the wave of condemnation that swept over him. Amy felt her heart begin to calm down. She felt, for the first time in a while, that she wasn't alone anymore, that she wasn't just a defenseless target for his hatred. She was supported, she was seen, and that realization filled her soul with warmth and strength. She looked at the boy. His eyes were still full of tears, but now there was a glimmer of hope shining in them. He didn't need to see a world filled with hate. Now he saw that there were those around him who were willing to stand up for him. The man realized that his position was weakening, that his power over the situation was crumbling. He looked back at the men, but instead of fear and respect, he saw in their eyes only cold, stern contempt. It made his inner anger flare up even more. But now he realized he couldn't take it out on Amy and the boy. His whole image of power and superiority crumbled before his eyes. He took a step back as if preparing to flee, but one of the young men in the crowd stepped forward, blocking his path. "You can't just walk away after what you've done," he said firmly. "You have to answer for your words and actions. People like you shouldn't go unpunished." The man stopped, his gaze darting around the crowd. He felt trapped again. Amy finally realized that the people around her were not just watching, but actively supporting her. Becoming a wall against this hatred, she took a step forward, daring to speak, her voice full of a grit and determination she hadn't had at the beginning of this confrontation. "You said that people like us would always be at the bottom, but now you can see that it's only you, with your hatred and fears, that's left at the bottom." Her voice was quiet, but the words rang like blows. "That child will grow up and become strong, despite the likes of you, and the world will change. It's inevitable." The man, hearing her words, turned pale again. He was pained at his scorn. His harsh, sarcastic words no longer had power over them. Now he was alone with his own hatred, and their realization made him retreat even further, his confidence melting away completely. He hissed something, turned and walked away, casting a parting glance of contempt and weakness, as if he couldn't bear the fact that he had to back down. Amy stared after him, feeling both relieved and heavy that this terrible moment was over. She leaned over to the boy who was still holding her hand. His face was covered in tears, but now his eyes shone with the realization that he was not alone. Amy smiled through his tears and whispered to him, "It's okay, you're the strong one. We made it through." They stood among a crowd that became an unexpected support and protection for them. Adults, children, elderly people, they all witnessed this moment and helped turn this day from a nightmare into a lesson in resilience and strength. Amy stood among the people, feeling her tense muscles gradually relaxing, her breathing returning to normal. She let go of the boy's hand, but it didn't take a step away from her. His small hand still clutched her fingers tightly, as if her presence was the only thread linking him to safety in this chaotic world. Tears still glistened in his eyes, but now relief and gratitude were mixed with fear. The passersby who surrounded them looked at her with concern. Someone patted her shoulder. Someone leaned over to comfort the boy. These people had come to her aid at a time when she and the boy had almost given up hope, when everything around them seemed darker than darkness itself. Amy felt their support warming her from the inside out, like light shining through an impenetrable wall. But despite this relief, she realized the boy would still have to come to terms with the reality that people like this man existed. The boy had seen the hatred and cruelty directed right at him, had seen him targeted just for being born the way he was. She couldn't protect him from that, couldn't shut the truth from him, but she could help him see that such moments can't be endured, that anger and hatred can be defeated. She knelt before him, their eyes meeting, and Amy tried to put all the love and support she could into her gaze. He looked at her, his eyes full of questions, bewilderment, and unspeakable grief. It was too hard for him to understand why someone could hate him so much, not knowing him, not seeing him as a normal child who just wanted to be happy and loved. "You know you're not alone, don't you?" she whispered, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "There are many people who will protect you, who love you. You should never let someone like him make you feel insignificant. You are so much stronger than they are." He sobbed and nodded, his face wet with tears, but there was determination in his eyes, as if her words were becoming a shield for him, protecting him from the pain he had just endured. But Amy knew that this conversation was only the beginning of a long journey. She knew that such wounds healed slowly, that every new instance of hatred or contempt he faced would remind him of today. She couldn't protect him from it all, but she could give him the strength to face such moments with fortitude. One of the people in the crowd, an elderly man with kind eyes, came closer and, addressing the boy, said, "You know, son, people who hurt others are always deeply unhappy. They don't realize that there is room in the world for everyone, and they waste their lives being angry. But things will be different for you. You be strong, and one day you'll see such people left behind, and you'll be happy because you won't let hate break you." These words, spoken with kindness and wisdom, made the boy sob again. but he looked at the older man with respect. There was a gratitude in his eyes that he may not have been able to put into words, but that reflected everything he was feeling at that moment. Amy rose slowly, feeling her own strength slowly returning. Her shoulder still hurt, her soul was wounded, but she realized that the struggle had not been in vain. She saw the understanding and support in the eyes of the people around her, and it was more than just sympathy for her. These people helped her to believe that their world, as dark as it seemed at times, was still full of light and goodness. When the man who had attacked them finally disappeared around the corner, Amy was relieved, as if the heavy cloud hanging over them had finally dissipated. But she realized that even if the man was gone, hatred like his would not completely disappear. She did. The boy would face bias and cruelty many more times, but she knew now that she would stand by his side each time, protect him and help him find the strength to resist. Amy turned to the boy again, trying to speak softly but firmly. There's a lot of joy ahead of us. You know, there are people who love you, who believe in you. Remember that hate always stays with those who carry it, but you don't have to accept it. You can be better than that. The boy nodded silently, his face expressing gratitude and a faint hope already glowing in his eyes. He was still trembling, still scared, but her words slowly brought him back to his senses, making him feel that the world was not so hopeless. When they finally began to leave, several passers-by offered to walk them home. Amy accepted their offer gratefully, feeling that, despite everything that had happened, they were surrounded by kind people, people who were willing to stand up for them, who could be part of his world, devoid of hate and fear. And, holding the boy's hand tightly, she knew that this day, despite all the evil, would be a lesson in resilience and strength, a lesson that would perhaps help him protect someone himself one day. As they walked down the street, Amy spoke softly, barely audible, addressing the world itself. May we have the strength to overcome this hatred. May the light always be stronger than the darkness. And the boy, hearing her words, shrank closer to her, his steps firmer and a faint but determined smile on his face. Amy and the boy walked down the street, surrounded by a few people who had volunteered to walk them home. Each step was difficult, and the silence that hung over them was no less heavy than the recent aggression. Amy could feel the tension that had been weighing her down all this time fading, but it left an emptiness behind, a strange sense of exhaustion, as after a long, exhausting struggle. At that moment she realized how exhausted she was, how deeply her fear for the boy had penetrated her. She squeezed his hand tighter, as if searching for confirmation that they were saved, that the threat was over. The boy walked on in silence, his gaze downward, and she could feel how withdrawn he was after what had happened. His tear-filled eyes reflected not just fright, but something deeper and more painful, a bewilderment, a confusion he could not yet put into words. He was still at the age when the world seemed a place of fairness and kindness, where adults protected rather than threatened. What he had seen today had shattered his faith in that picture, and there was a silent despair in his eyes, as if he no longer knew where to seek refuge from this cruel reality. They approached his house, and Amy, feeling the need to explain herself, leaned over to meet his gaze. "Are you still scared?" Her voice was soft. She tried to be careful, not wanting to intrude on his pain, but realizing he needed to hear her words. He nodded, and new tears glistened in his eyes. Her heart clenched, seeing how much this encounter had shaken him. She wanted to say something comforting to him, but in that moment her words seemed so insignificant in the face of the pain he had just endured. She realized that no phrase could erase from his memory the man's face full of contempt, his words that struck like blows. He was so small, so vulnerable to that hatred, and Amy felt how deeply that realization pierced her heart. "I know it was scary," she whispered, barely containing the shiver in her voice. "And what he said wasn't true. Everything he said was just him being angry, and it had nothing to do with you. You're special, you're kind, and that's your strength." The boy was silent, his eyes staring into the void, and Amy realized that he would have trouble understanding her words, that his fear and bewilderment were deeper than she had realized. His face was childlike, but in that moment she saw something adult in it, as if he had discovered through pain and fear something she had tried so long to shield him from. One of the passers-by, a woman with a kind face, saw this silent interaction and approached him. "You don't have to be afraid, little one. The world is full of good people who will protect you, who will always take your side. That man was angry and unhappy, and his hatred is his own pain, not yours. Those words, spoken in a calm, warm voice, seemed to penetrate the boy, made him finally raise his head and made her gaze. There was a faint hope in his eyes, as if he was trying to believe what he was being told, trying to see in these adults not a threat, but the support, the protection he so desperately sought. Amy, sensing that he still needed her support, pulled him against her, letting him feel her warmth and safety. She knew that this moment would be something he would remember forever, but she also hoped that he would remember not only the anger and hatred, but the caring kindness of the people who surrounded them, who were ready to stand up for him. "You're not alone," she whispered, like an incantation. "You'll never be alone, and I'll always be by your side. And these people, they're all here to show you that hate will always be a thing of the past if we stick together." The boy, with a barely audible sob, clung to her, and she felt his little heart beating next to hers. She knew that this moment was the beginning of a long journey, that he had yet to come to terms with the fact that the world could be cruel but also full of kindness. And, at balance, that struggle between light and darkness was something he would have to overcome more than once. When they entered his house, Amy walked him to his room, helped him take off his jacket, and made sure he was settled on the bed. She knew that once she left, the fear might return again, that his nights might be filled with nightmares and memories of this man's hatred. But at the same time, she believed that despite everything, his soul would be stronger, his heart would remain open to goodness and love. She sat her next to him on the edge of the bed, and as she looked at him, she felt her eyes fill with tears. She knew she couldn't shield him from all the evil in the world, but she would be there to show him every time that goodness existed too, that he deserved to be loved and protected. She took his hand again and said, "You're stronger than you think, and I'm proud of you. Always remember that you are not alone, that there are people who will be with you no matter what." The boy nodded quietly, his face serious, but something like a faint smile flickered in his eyes. Amy realized that it was a small step toward recovery, toward understanding that he was the exception, not the norm. And now that he knew that, he had a chance to grow up with the realization that the world could be better, that people could be better. She stood up, and he looked at her as if he wanted her to say she understood that, but knew he had to be given time. As she closed the door behind her, her heart filled with conflicting feelings of relief, pain, but also quiet joy that this day was not only a test for him, but a lesson in resilience and love. When Amy walked out of the boy's house, she was overwhelmed by a wave of feelings she could hardly comprehend. Her heart was still pounding hard, her mind reeling with the words and scenes she tried to protect the child from. She realized that she had to take action to ensure that moments like these did not go unnoticed. At people like this, man could not sow hatred and fear with impunity. Her shaking fingers dialed a number, and a moment later she was talking to the police operator, explaining everything that had happened. Her voice shook, but she tried to speak clearly, each word giving weight to the case. She talked about the attack, about the hatred that came from the man, and how passersby intervened when the situation became unbearable. You could hear the pain in her voice, but also the determination, as if every utterance was not only about what had happened, but about her demand for justice, her desire to protect other children, other women, other people from similar fear. She knew that the boy should not have seen this, should not have been the target of such ruthless hatred. As she ended the call and put her phone in her pocket, someone's hand gently touched her shoulder. She looked over and saw the woman who had intervened with a few encouraging words. Her eyes were understanding and supportive, as if she knew what Amy was feeling right now, as if she had ever faced such hatred herself. "You did the right thing," the woman said with a soft, reassuring smile. "Things like that can't be left unchecked. People need to know that hate will not go unpunished." Amy nodded, her eyes filled with the tears she was struggling to hold back. This woman's support was something unexpected and necessary for her at this moment. She felt like she was reliving that awful moment all over again, when she felt utterly helpless, trapped in anger. But this woman's words were bringing her back to a sense of safety. They stood side by side, and Amy realized that she wasn't alone in this, that there were people who understood and were willing to support. It was only a few minutes later that other people began to gather around her. The very people who had witnessed the attack. Some offered to drive her home. Some exchanged contacts, promising to testify if the case went to trial. Each of these people seemed incredibly important to her now. They were strangers, but it was their intervention that symbolized to her that justice was possible, that even in the darkest moment, light could come. She could feel the tension slowly receding, her heart filled with pain and anger making room for gratitude. Her soul was slowly filling with the realization that this evening, as horrible as it had been, had also been a moment when she had seen what a community of people united for good could do. The man who had attacked them had wanted to isolate them, to break them, but it had been the one left alone at the end, surrounded by judgment and scorn. The evening lights of the street, the cold wind, the silence, everything reminded her that the world could be cruel and dangerous, but also full of people who were willing to stand up for others. She was overwhelmed by this discovery, and a sense of relief filled her heart with renewed strength. Someone in the group supporting her said quietly, "People like this man often think that their words and actions will leave no trace. They can't go unpunished. But with every moment like this, with every intervention, show that this is not the case. We will not allow this to be the norm." Those words left a deep impression on her. She knew that the boy still had many hardships ahead of him, that he would continue to face such things, but he was no longer alone, and neither was she. She had a whole support network, people who were willing to walk with her to the end. Amy took a deep breath, let go of her tension, and, feeling the support around her, whispered, "Thank you all. You have no idea how much this means to both of us. This night was a lesson to us, a lesson that good always wins." People nodded, and some of them leaned over to hug her, offering her simple but much needed support at this moment. It was several days after the incident, but the memories of that night remained vivid and painful in Amy's heart. The boy's questions and words, his trembling voice, his tear-filled eyes, his frightened, "Did I do something wrong?" All these things came back to her, mind like reanimated wounds that time had not yet been able to heal. Amy realized that the most important thing now was to help him believe in the world again, to teach him to see the light even as he faced the darkness head-on. She knew she had to find strength not only for herself, but for him as well, because their experience was now shared, their pain shared. Inspired by the support they received from the men of that night, Amy decided to do more. She realized that the man was not alone in his attitude, that there were still people in their community who carried the poison of prejudice and hatred, and yet she saw that there were also those around her who could not put up with it. She realized that indifference only reinforced cruelty, that fear of being misunderstood or rejected made many people silent at times like this. But now she was ready to change that. Amy did not hesitate to write posts on social media, describing what had happened. She described every detail, hiding neither her pain nor her fear. She spoke openly about the hatred they faced, the injustice and cruelty, but also about those who became their defense, who came to their aid when they no longer expected it. Her words came from the heart, and she spoke with sincerity, encouraging people to reflect, to find the courage to intervene when they see injustice, when they see someone suffering because of bias or aggression. No one deserves to be feared for who they are. She wrote, "No one should feel alone in the face of cruelty. Our strength lies in our unity, in our willingness to support and protect each other. We must not be silent. We must not turn away. Each of us can be the light that overcomes the darkness." Her words resonated with people. Hundreds of comments appeared under the posts. People shared their stories, moments when they, too, faced hatred or indifference, when they were judged or insulted just because of their origin, their skin color, because they were different. Amy read these stories, and her heart filled with pain and compassion. She saw that many, like her, were afraid for the future, for their children, for their families, and yet they found the strength to fight. She began to actively communicate with these people, organizing meetings and discussions. Together, they decided to do more, to hold educational meetings in schools, to teach children about equality, respect, and dignity, that everyone deserves a safe life, regardless of their background or appearance. Amy believed that if these conversations started at an early age. Children would grow up understanding that hate and prejudice are a choice, not an inevitability, that everyone can and should take responsibility for making the world a better place. One day, she was invited to speak to high school students at a local school and, excited and a little nervous, she accepted. She knew that there would be many young faces in front of her, those who were just beginning to realize themselves and their place in the world, who were just learning to understand what was right and wrong. This was an opportunity to change the future, an opportunity to plant the seeds of kindness and respect in these hearts. She stood in front of the audience. The room was quiet and all eyes were on her. Amy took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was firm, but full of pain and determination. Recently, my friend and I had a scary moment. We were the target of hate, and it was monstrously painful. I saw the fear in the eyes of a child who didn't yet understand why someone could hate him so much just for who he was. I saw his confusion and terror, and it was intolerable. No one should have to feel that way, and each of you can be the person who says a no to that hate, who stands up for yourself when you see injustice. She told the story of that night, without softening the details, to show how important courage and kindness are in such moments. She saw how her words moved the boys. Understanding and empathy appeared in their eyes. She knew there could be those in that room who had faced hate and those who may not have thought about it. But now she believed that when they heard her story, they would not be indifferent.